how do you think the US administration and establishment more broadly tries to navigate this? Because if Trump is so it's this and dismissing anything that the media says, even if it's coming from independent reports that aren't mainstream media, isn't that a bit of a problem?
Problem was when the president announced the strikes and said that the sites were completely obliterated, and he used that term, and then everybody had to hold that line and say, well, that's what's been done. And there's no way they would have known at that point. The correct statement should have been the strikes hit their targets. Like General Kane said a couple days later, the strikes hit their targets. We did exactly what we wanted to do. The pilots are all safe. It's going to take a little bit of time for us to know the effects of those munitions. That's the actual answer. That's the true answer. And unfortunately, President Trump went with obliterated right out the gate, which spurred all of this other unnecessary debate back and forth. It doesn't matter. If we don't know, then we don't know.
This is the Global Gambit.
Defense, military matters, national security. More now than ever is a critical time. You just have to look at certain stocks of certain, companies, and you know that they're doing quite well. Alternatively, you can look at Iran and some nuclear facilities, which look very different than they did, say, 2.5 weeks ago. Or you can look at Russia and Ukraine and the role of drones. The point I'm making is there's a lot to understand and cover. And so in this video, I wanted to break all that down with one of my extra special guests. Let's get into it. Today, I am speaking with Preston Stewart, prolific YouTuber and TikToker. I said iconic off camera, but he said YouTube was fine. But we're going with prolific now, Preston, because it has alliteration and I like alliteration. But welcome back, mate. We had you on in February, I believe, and it was really good chat. But I really wanted to cover this, sort of conversation, partly Ukraine and Russia, but then also sort of US national security, defense, and what's been going on that front. So, just to begin with, I guess, what are you making of all the things that are happening in the world right now vis-a-vis the US and its national security?
No, Pyotr, appreciate it, man. Always fun to have a chat, and it's hard to beat, going anywhere where you start with iconic YouTuber. I know that wasn't on camera, but I want to bring it in now, and that just, the humble side of me really appreciates that. It's chaos, man. It has been an absolute chaotic couple weeks. I think in a lot of ways there's been so much focus on Russia, Ukraine, understandably so. And over the course of the last, I'll say 3 weeks now, we really shifted in the United States to focusing almost exclusively on what was going on with Iran and Israel. And then, of course, the United States involvement there. So it's interesting because we've seen that a couple times, I think, with Ukraine. It's been going. And then October 7th happened. And at least in the United States, we kind of shifted our focus for a period of time. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that again right now.
Yeah, and I think what I want to do is maybe leave the deeper diving with Ukraine and Russia for the second part, but because it's still fresh in our minds. And I've been watching all your videos, incredible engagement, incredible consistency in coverage, man. How you've been turning out those videos on a daily basis, covering the US perspective, Iran, Israel. And I guess, to talk about the US national security element, what were your reactions when you first were realizing or hearing of the fact that these B-2 bombers had gone to Iran, dropped these 14 bunker busting bombs, but also it was a misdirection, to quote Pete Hegseth. Incredible bit of work there by the State Department and Defense Department. Right?
It was a couple phases there. When Israel kicked their attacks off, it was an, oh my God, this is actually happening type of moment. And I'd say the US bombing run was kind of the cherry on top. They carried it out in a way to where there's a lot of lead up, and we kind of saw this coming or expected that something might play out. And as you mentioned, there were very public B-2 flights heading west, and everybody was watching those across social media, and turned out the actual B-2s struck from the east. So nice piece of misdirection there. But for days, we'd been talking about that. And it wasn't shocking in the sense that the stage had really been set. Israel has done incredible work knocking out the Iranian air defense network. And the time the B-2s went in, that was the lowest risk to American aircraft in Iranian airspace in decades, if not ever. So if you're President Trump or Secretary Hegseth or a U.S. voter saying we need to take some sort of action here, there was no better time than when they did carry it out. So everything was kind of trending in that direction. That said, oh my God, for 20 plus years, we've been talking about the possibility of going to war with Iran or maybe taking military action against Iran. And there have been some large accounts on the internet that have borderline made a career talking about how that would be, maybe the end of the United States or the start of some giant regional or global war. So it was shocking in a sense. And you felt like you were living through history, to be blunt, like watching it play out and then waiting to see what exactly took place in the next couple of days.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not to be pluggy too much, but for people who don't know my channel, it's very international. I do a lot more interviewing than I just do analysis like you do your fantastic coverage. And so I've had quite a few people coming on to talk about the Iranian perspective, someone who was the former, I think, Iran envoy to the Biden administration, Vali Nassar. And, the discussion we're talking about here is a scenario that the world, analysts, us as people have been fearing on the one hand, but also, just sort of thinking about for decades. And it finally happened. The US directly engaged with Iran. And what did it do in your mind? To me, it revealed Iran to be a bit of a paper tiger. I don't want to understate that they are still a potent force. It's still Iran. It's not, no offense to Guatemala, but it's not Guatemala. So what does that speak to you about the US's ability to project power in that way still, in a way that we haven't seen since, the withdrawal of Afghanistan or something?
I think we have to step back a little bit here because the Iranian threat is multifaceted, right? They've got their ballistic missiles, short, medium, long range to target either U.S. bases or airfields all the way to Israel. Then they've got their proxy network, of course, and the most recent concern has been, or the one that prompted this action, was their nuclear program or the development of nuclear weapons. And I think we are at risk right now of looking at this B-2 strike and saying, that did it. That was the thing. Perfectly executed, well executed. Not a shot fired against the B-2s, by the way, from all accounts, which is crazy. But I think to get to that point...
Can I interject? But were they even detected?
There's no indication that they were detected.
Not from what I've read. Yeah. So, it's even more than that, right?
Right. Yeah. Not only not shot fired, but not even noticed.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just curious.
You're right. Yeah.
You've seen more information on that because
they couldn't have fired if they wanted to because they didn't know there was anything overhead. Yeah. But if we step back a little bit, the conditions have been set here for quite a while. And it really started, I think, on or about October 7th with the Hamas attack into Israel. That began Israel's response against some of the key Iranian proxies. Now, it took them a while to do anything directly towards Iran, but the moment that Israel started fighting back against Hamas in an open war, it tied up that proxy network. Then they pushed up north and it tied up, and they eventually pretty well dismantled Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is in a much worse place today than they were October 7th, October 8th, when that attack first kicked off. The Houthis arguably are probably doing okay. They've fended off the United States and Israel to a degree at this point, and they're a little more geographically isolated than some of the others. Assad fell in Syria, opened up the airspace there. Iraq has always kind of been a free fly zone for what it's worth. And then Israel went in and started hitting Iran. So we saw the destruction of their long-range missiles, their ballistic missiles that were out ready to launch. We saw the elimination of some of their senior leadership, the destruction of facility after facility, and then again, the cherry on top being the U.S. hitting specifically Fordo nuclear facility. All of that together, I don't think I think the challenge is we look at a snapshot and say Iran is weak because this one attack was so easy. And I think we miss all the buildup that got us to that point.
No, for sure. Again, we've covered this a lot. What's known as the Shia Crescent, right, that stems from Lebanon down. We can talk about the dismantling or effective dismantling Hamas. We can talk about the almost disintegration of Hezbollah and the incredible pager attack. And the thing that does link Ukraine and Israel, which is why I like to sort of bring them together when we have our chats, is because they seem to be, the military, the intelligence, do seem to be taking ideas. There's been some suggestions that Mossad have been giving tips to Ukrainian intelligence, but operation, now that I want to mention it, the operation that the Ukrainians managed, right?
Spiderweb.
Spiderweb, right? You always lose it when you want to say it. It was partially inspired by the Pyotr attack late last year against Nasrallah. But then the Syrian collapse, whether or not that was foreseen or not, the fact that you've lost a puppet nation state, which was so integral to the overall proxy network of Iran, really was a killer blow, I think. So, of course, it's very important not to just focus on the recent events, but to spin it on its head. Obviously, Israel's remarkable military efforts, ops in Iran, paved the way, arguably, for the United States to come in again. But do you not think that this is a problem potentially for the Trump administration? Because they want to focus on China. They want to try to, well, not rid themselves or whatever, but be less involved. And now they've had to redirect a carrier strike group to the region. Maybe it's on its way back, I'm not sure. But they've had to reallocate these assets. So do you not think that this is problematic for the Trump administration?
I mean, there's a running joke that like we can't get away from. It's called Central Command for it's where the military. We have these regional commands. Central Command is the Middle East, and it's just a running joke. Like we can't get away from CENTCOM. No matter what we try, no matter what we do, there's the largest land war in Europe raging since World War II, and we're sending extra carriers to CENTCOM. China is the number one priority for at least this administration. I think for a couple now they've said that, and we're sending more carriers to CENTCOM. So it's just this. Yeah, we're stuck there. I think a bigger challenge is that the issue isn't resolved. And I'm a little concerned about that because we're kind of, celebrating a little bit this incredible accomplishment, but the Iranian nuclear program is not gone. It might be severely degraded, but like, I don't know, but I was searching today for the status of the negotiations. Nobody's even talking about that. Like there's no talk about the talks and when those are going to happen. And I'm a little bit concerned that we walk away from this. We were talking about everything that got to the point for these strikes to be effective at all. And I think there's a real argument to say Israel had to go because never in their history has Iran been so weak. Has the door been open for them to inflict this sort of damage? It would have been almost reckless to not take advantage of it. But nothing has changed all that drastically. Iran is still today threatening the United States and threatening Israel, saying that they are not going to stop enriching uranium. They're going to continue funding their proxy networks. Like it's the same thing. They took some blows, no doubt, but I think we're risking considering that done when it's not.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, without being partisan about it, but obviously we do have a big disparity between what certain people are saying. You've got CNN coming out with initial reports saying that the damages, initial assessments are not what they say, and then Trump obviously reacting to that. And it's supplemented by additional ones in the New York Times or whatever Europe says. Analysis suggests that the damage has only set Iran back a few months, not years. Like, how do you think the US administration and establishment more broadly tries to navigate this? Because if Trump is so, it's this, and dismissing anything that the media says, even if it's coming from independent reports that aren't mainstream media, isn't that a bit of a problem?
Yeah, the problem originated, and maybe this ends up sounding partisan, it's not intended to be, but the problem was when the president announced the strikes and said that the sites were completely obliterated, and he used that term, and then everybody had to hold that line and say, well, that's what's been done. And there's no way they would have known at that point. The correct statement should have been, the strikes hit their targets. Like General Kane said a couple days later, the strikes hit their targets. We did exactly what we wanted to do. The pilots are all safe. It's going to take a little bit of time for us to know the effects of those munitions. That's the actual answer. That's the true answer. And unfortunately, President Trump went with obliterated right out the gate, which spurred all of this other unnecessary debate back and forth. It doesn't matter. If we don't know, then we don't know. That doesn't help anything. But if we even set that aside entirely, and say, we're not going to talk about the damage to Fordo and obliterated or not, there's still a pretty clear assessment that there's some enriched uranium in Iran that we don't know where it is. And we are starting to see more U.S. lawmakers talk about that as well. In fact, after a classified briefing last week about the damage of these strikes, we had people on the right and left side of the aisle, so Republicans and Democrats, come out and specifically say the already enriched uranium was not a part of the target set. We weren't trying to destroy it, which to me, kind of reading between the lines, is saying, no, hold on. Don't include that in the effectiveness of these strikes, right? So even that piece alone means that there's work still to be done, whether it's military or most likely some sort of negotiation.
Yeah, I think from the European perspective, there's quite a large amount of skepticism about the extent to which it's been destroyed. And given, obviously, the E3 or the Brits, the French and the Germans who've been part of the JCPOA negotiations for all this time, there's a renewed desire to want to try to, claw back some of the maximalist statements that Trump says, as with a lot of things. So one does wonder about also how likely the talks are, I think, because the US is not going to restrain Israel to maybe continue actions as and when it sees fit. which but then inhibits the Iranians from wanting to talk. And the deputy foreign minister was quoted as saying that, I think, in the past couple of days. So it just makes me wonder whether or not, well, actually, come to think of it, on this whole point of telegraphing, actually, I'll reframe my point as a question, which was, the Americans were being very clear in the run up to that actual Saturday night that, are we going to, are we not? What do you think that was telling us about US propensities to sort of prepare the world for potential US action? Because there was a lot of telegraphing beforehand, and we still did, and then Trump says, oh, we're going to wait a couple of weeks. And then 2 days later, he did it, right? That's what, again, effective intelligence to you?
I think there's a couple different ways to read that. And I have not heard the administration come out and say that they were actively involved in any sort of deception with the Iranians outside of the planes going east instead of west. Just a straight up military deception. You're looking at the wrong planes. We did that, no problem. But as Israeli planes were taking off to strike Israel, President Trump posted to Truth Social, there's still time for diplomacy. I want to give diplomacy a chance, something along those lines, to where, like, in retrospect, that was either incredible deception, keeping up that side of the story, or the less likely is that the United States maybe wasn't aware of the exact timeline. But I think we're getting more and more information that the U.S. was pretty read in to when and how these strikes were going to play out. So that would mean that President Trump was, to a degree, playing a part in the deception, keeping the Iranians off kilter as Israeli jets were inbound, which, from a purely military perspective, awesome work. But when you look at this from a diplomatic side, how much does that affect the Iranians' desire or willingness to come back to the table at all?
Yeah. And what do you think, therefore, about this aspect of Qatar that obviously was the sort of climax, if you like? These strikes against the military base just outside Doha. Now, I was running a space at the time on X, and we were getting the information live, and one of the first things I saw was that, the Iranians had communicated this directly to the Americans. Hey, look, we're going to strike this base at this time, in this quantity or in this way. Interesting, because it sort of reminds me of the red telephone kind of thing between the Soviets and the Americans in the Cold War. That sort of, there is that direct line of contact. We don't want to kill any of your staff, but we do want to respond. This sort of measured escalation, if you like. What were your takeaways from that? Is it a good thing?
Weird. I mean, in retrospect, I'm glad they did it, right? I'm glad they called us and told us what was going on. But we were watching this play out where there was a shelter-in-place order issued in Qatar. I was like, well, that's weird. What's that about? And then a couple hours later, Fox News said an Iranian attack against Qatar is imminent. I was like, where the hell are they getting this information from? And then like an hour later, the missiles were launched. So there was clearly a lot of folks in the know, and the base had been evacuated of aircraft weeks or at least days prior. Like, on the base, according to the Defense Department, there were only like 18 or 20 U.S. personnel in total, and they were manning the Patriot batteries. So they just got everybody out of there. So I like that. I like that they told us before they did anything, and we were able to mitigate the possible damage. But it comes across as weird. Like, to bring it back, is Iran a paper tiger, like you said? Like, is that the best for all of this? Again, a bunch of their nuclear scientists were actually, just go with the U.S. response and say we just hit Fordo. At least a little bit of damage somewhere. You can't set off those size of bombs and not have some degree of damage to very delicate centrifuges. So there's some degree of damage. I think you could say, embarrassed the Iranians by flying these stealth bombers halfway around the world undetected, carrying out strikes and going home. And their response is to a show to send a couple missiles. It's weird. And I wonder if, I think the standard through line is Iran did not want to escalate, but a part of me wonders if maybe they didn't have anything above and beyond that they could have done. I mean, they could have tried to overwhelm some other U.S. bases in the region, but I wonder if maybe they're just weaker right now than we think.
No, I think they're in an unprecedented position. It's all about regime survival, I think, at this point. But that sort of makes me wonder, therefore, where do you think this could go? I did a video recently on the ammunition shortage crisis, the concern of the ability to sustain support to Israel. For example, like when it was beginning to get to the head where the Iranians, yes, they had their issues, but if they continue to fire rockets in the frequency that they could, they have a huge stockpile, as I'm sure you know. then they were beginning to overwhelm Israeli defenses, right? The Israelis were running low on interceptors, for example. And the American government, from what I understood, were quietly worried about their ability to reliably supply the Israelis. Is that true? And if so, what do you think some changes could be happening to amend that?
I don't have the information as to whether or not that's entirely accurate. It passes the common sense test, though. Interceptors are always going to be more expensive than the munitions, especially when Iran is using some of those drones. Long-range drones are incredibly cheap by comparison. And Israel just doesn't produce that many. I mean, they produce a lot of interceptors, but it's always been kind of widely assumed that there's more missiles than there are interceptors. I think at times the number of missiles that could range Israel were 2,000, 2,500. And I think it was the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago brought that up and said the U.S. is starting to get nervous that Israel can only maintain this degree of defense for another 10 to 12 days. So, I think there's an argument here that the ceasefire, in a sense, the ceasefire is weird, man, because there's no terms, right? It was just everybody just stopped. Like, okay, everybody good to stop for a minute? Like, time out? That's what it feels like. Exactly. Who's monitoring it? Like, there's stuff blowing up in Iraq today. Nobody knows who did that. Is that a part of this? But as a part of this, you have to think from Israel's perspective, it gives them the opportunity to rebuild some of these areas. Maybe not going to be a lot of rebuilding in a short period of time for some of those structures that were destroyed, but they can start to replenish some of their interceptors, maybe order some more that are available abroad. It does give them a bit of a breather. And the same can be said of Iran. They've been, the last few days of this conflict, there were UAVs hunting Iranian leadership over Tehran. That is wild that we got to that point at all. So the fact that that's not happening is a big win for Iran. So again, it just feels like a pause.
We're so far in at this point, right? A year and a half ago, we had October 7th, or thereabouts, just over. And if you told me 18 months plus later that we would finally see, as I opened with, this scenario that many people have feared, many people have predicted for decades, to actually come to pass. Iran has lost its plausible deniability guise, right? Always ability to blame something else that wasn't ours, we don't know what you mean, sort of thing. They can't do that anymore. And they've been revealed to be quite vulnerable. And, awkwardly so, that they don't have as much capacity to project power as they wanted. I've got colleagues in Washington from my time who are saying, why did we bother spending years of our life talking about the existential threat that is Iran?
Yeah, right.
Again, I don't want to play it down. They're still, it takes a certain tenacity to be in power for that long and export power that effectively. But yeah, certainly. But anyway, this comes to sort of, therefore, the discussion around America's commitment to so many different places at once, right? Sort of to bring it full circle, right? And as we begin to shift towards the Ukrainian discussion a bit more, Trump wants to see more European powers contributing to NATO, and that deal was a big success. Just 24 hours after this ceasefire, we've now got NATO. But, just to sort of wrap up this first part, what do you think the United States needs to do then, or the Trump administration, to better stabilize the American sense of control in military terms? Because at the moment, it looks like there's more and more countries that can sort of destabilize, be more reckless, and America sort of is it overstretched, I guess is my question.
It's an interesting time to have that conversation because a lot of the kind of core Trump base is not fully isolationist, but trending a little more in that direction than we might normally see from a Republican president. So the argument that we might be overstretched is going to reach some as bring them home. We should not be overstretched. We should not commit more forces to the Middle East. And Trump has done a pretty impressive job, all things considered, of being able to talk about no more wars, no more troops overseas. We have to focus here at home while simultaneously kind of building up forces in the Middle East for this event, taking on the Houthis, taking on Iran.
Yeah, but it's a bit of but he's doing the opposite of what he said he would do, right?
Right.
America first.
Kind of. I mean,
Why kind of?
Well, so first off, the challenge with so frustrating in American politics, we tend to have folks that their view of something changes depending on who does it. So like, anyways, it's hard to dial in. Like, yes, if you hold to his word, President Trump, based off the campaign, it would have been surprising that he did anything military action against Iran, and it would have been surprising that he carried out strikes against the Houthis. It would not have been surprising that he had some tough negotiations, but he seemed so averse to any sort of additional conflict. The other side of that is both of those have been very short-term engagements. And I think that's where they're trying to kind of thread the needle here, is to say we have to show power, we have to take action, but look, we're not getting into a 20-year war. We don't have boots on the ground. And I don't know if that ends up being better or worse. Honestly, like the Houthis, that's not resolved at all. We just kind of said we're going to stop. And both sides declared victory. I feel like he's kind of getting the best of both worlds at this point, and it appears to be working, at least domestically.
Well, all right, that's quite a tooth nail biter. We'll see where that goes.
Well, but that's the frustrating thing with the Iranian nuclear program, right? Like we might get the domestic political wins of saying it was obliterated, but if it actually isn't, then what good is that at all? If we're going to have to go back and do it again, or I think it's an interesting idea. Does this make them more interested in pursuing a nuclear weapon faster and more secretly? I think that's a real question, right?
If you want my opinion, yes,
yeah.
I think it does, because it's the one thing that makes the regime, slightly more untouchable, right? It legitimizes them, it protects them more, because if you've got that weapon, you have to really think as the adversary or the opposing party, in this case the US, how you're going to deal with that. But second, it also means there's a certain degree of legitimacy it evokes to their domestic audience, their own population, right? It's very difficult to ascertain what Iranians on the ground think, because there's not exactly free media or expression, but they're not as hated as the West likes to claim, right? There is a significant proportion, I'm not saying majority, minority, just a large percentage that do seem to be, maybe it's not even about the regime, but sort of opposed to American interventionism, opposed to interference. You can see that they held some protests around the streets of Tehran in the past week after the events, burying the military figures and stuff. If it was staged or embellished, I'm not going to pretend I know, but the point is that it's not like every single Iranian is pro-America and anti-regime. It's much more nuanced than that. But still, we'll park that and we'll come back to that in the future.